So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our national roundtable. This was already a crisis, intersectional impact of COVID-19 and gender-based violence against non-status, refugee, and immigrant women across Canada. So for today's meeting, we encourage you to be in speaker view so you can follow along with our shared screen. And we want everyone today to participate in the ways that feel comfortable to you, and at the same time to help kind of minimize distractions and also to keep a safe space. We've disabled the camera option and microphones are muted for all participants in case you're wondering what's going on with your microphone or your camera. Throughout today's presentation, we're going to have one of our team members, Taskeen, who's going to have her eyes on the chat. So you have the ability to chat with others, to send messages, to message to everyone that's participating in the call. And we encourage you to please share your comments, your feedback. If you have any technical issues, we'll try our very best. And Taskeen will actually be compiling a list of the questions and the comments that we're receiving throughout this call. So we really aim to be able to address some of those questions, and we're going to allot the last 15 to 20 minutes of our session, as long as we don't go over time, to be able to respond to some of those questions. And if we don't get to it today, we're going to do our very best to respond and follow up with everyone when we share our recording, our PowerPoint, and feedback survey in the following days. So to start to kind of activate the chat, we really encourage you to share your location. So let us know where you are, and if you'd like the organization, networks, or communities that you're joining us from. We're going to start with a land acknowledgement. This presentation today is being hosted on the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations. Takaranto, also known as Toronto, is now home to many Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. It's important for us from the onset to really express our solidarity with Indigenous communities across Turtle Island who continue to experience colonial violence, including intersectional gender-based violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. It's been a year since the reporting on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people in Canada. And it's really important for us to reflect on what that means and what it means for us to do this work in that context, and to host those conversations in this context. We also really draw from critical race scholars in Canada who've recognized the importance of addressing colonial violence as a first step in healing across communities. We take seriously the notion that Shireen Razak emphasized in 2014, which is that we can't move into recognizing the humanity of refugees, of immigrants, or other people if our day-to-day life is intensely structured by the inhumanity with which we've treated Indigenous people in Canada. So we want to start by saying welcome and thank you for joining us today. We are heartened by the number of people who've registered across Canada. My name is Margarita Pinton-Perez, and I'm the Senior Coordinator of the Initiative to End Gender-Based Violence at OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. Joining me today as co-hosts of this conversation are Selina Abji, a sociologist and research consultant based in Toronto, who is also a community organizer with the Rights of Non-Status Women Network, and Nira Elgueta, project coordinator for the Gender-Based Violence Building Leadership Capacity at OCASI. So on April 30th, which now feels like a long time ago, we introduced the first virtual roundtable to host conversations and exchanges that consider the differential impacts of COVID-19 for non-status refugee and immigrant women across Canada. These webinar series really work from a social justice approach that suggests that more comprehensive analysis and collective discussion of the social problems that we are talking about today will yield more effective social actions, advocacy, strategies, and responses. On the screen is a memory from last year when Nira, Selina, and I hosted community gatherings and community consultations centered around food and connecting all across Canada. Today, we're going to be sharing some of our findings from these meetings and gatherings with community members, service providers, and also our conversations with non-status refugee and immigrant women across Canada. Some of what we present today is about an opportunity to really work out some of these ideas through conversation. So we really do hope to hear your feedback, thoughts, and questions. And as we shared at the first roundtable, this is not necessarily about leading the conversation, but leveraging and hosting these conversations at a national level. All right, so we also want to acknowledge the team, the network that's worked together so hard to plan and host this roundtable series. So this roundtable series is part of the project for building leadership capacity to address gender-based violence against non-status refugee and immigrant women across Canada. It's organized by a growing network of service providers, organizational leaders, community advocates, and academic researchers working together on a national project focused on building capacity of peer leadership and building capacity of community advocacy networks. So as this network grows, we really value all of the contributions and participation of all the members of this network, kind of challenging this idea of expert and this idea that really we all come to the network with experiences and perspectives, and we really look forward to this, this network to grow alongside the project. Next, Selena is going to take over and review some of our project objectives and the agenda.
Thanks, Margarita. Hi, everybody. I'm so delighted to be here today. And I'm going to start by just situating us. So why are we here today? Why are we bringing all of you together? And really what we want to do is we want to show how prior to COVID-19, which we've been hearing so much about and experiencing, but prior to COVID-19, this was already a crisis for non-status refugee and immigrant women, which we refer to as NSRI women in the presentation. And so we want to do that by highlighting some of the gaps in gender-based violence services and community advocacy supports that we discovered through our field research in 5 sites across the country. We also want to share with you a snapshot of what does community advocacy actually look like across Canada, because we had the, we were delighted to have the opportunity to engage with advocates and service providers and NSRI women doing a lot of community advocacy work. So what does that look like? And then we want to take a key idea that we're very much in our project supportive of, which is survivor-centered models, but we really want to show how the research really pushed us to challenge many of our assumptions that we'd had about survivor-centered and how could we think more critically about that. In addition to doing kind of that through sharing our research, we're going to kind of circle back then to really think about what the implications are of this research for this critical moment that we find ourselves in, which is the COVID-19 moment. And we're going to end by kind of sharing a little bit about our plan moving forward and how those of you who want to get involved and have the capacity to do so can do that. So those are our 3 objectives. In terms of the outline of the presentation, before getting into the research, we want to start just with a little bit of an overview of the broader project that this research is a part of. Then we'll get into the thick of it with sharing our research findings. And then, as I mentioned at the end, we'll think about the implications for the work we're doing. We're hoping to have some time at the end for a Q&A. And we're hoping that some of the discussion can really kind of think about the impacts of COVID-19 on the crisis that that already existed that we're going to be sharing with you today. Okay, Margarita, I think I'm handing it over to you.
Great, thank you, Selena. All right, so to start, we're going to just briefly tell the story of our project. So this project is titled Building Leadership Capacity to Address Gender-Based Violence Against Non-Status Refugee and Immigrant Women Across Canada. We like to kind of highlight this story of this project, of how it came to be, because it highlights how grassroots groups can work in collaboration and allyship with social service delivery agencies who are also working to champion anti-gender-based violence efforts. So the project really comes out of decades of community-based advocacy modeled after the Rights of Non-Status Women's Network and initiatives based in capacity building towards survivor-centered, more survivor-centered focused initiatives by and for non-status refugee and immigrant women with a focus on GBV, which is modeled after Ocassie's Peer Champions campaign. So if we start, for over 14 years, the Rights of Non-Status Women's Network, a grassroots network of service providers and activists, has been gathering together to really strategize around how to best support women with precarious immigration status and deal with kind of the multiple forms of violence in their lives. And in the case of the work that we're modeling after Ocassie's Peer Champions campaign, in 2016, the Immigrant and Refugee Community's Neighborhood Friends and Family Peer Champions campaign started, and it's an Ontario-wide initiative coordinated by Ocassie to raise awareness about violence against women in immigrant and refugee communities. And the goal of this campaign is really to educate communities across Ontario to recognize the signs and risks of violence against women and to equip them with the necessary tools to support women experiencing domestic violence. In addition, this work brings together years of public education campaign led by both the Rights of Non-Status Women's Network and also Ocassie. In the case of Ocassie, we're looking at public education campaigns on sexual violence and harassment. Some of you might know about our graphic novel, Telling Our Stories, which is available in multiple languages. And also prior to this initiative and part of this ongoing work has been to provide online courses and webinars focused on gender-based violence, on sexual violence prevention in immigrant and refugee communities. So these are really relevant kinds of parts of the story that have contributed and brought us together in this current project. And to kind of further that and to help make sense even more of how we come together with this kind of decades of work of advocacy and initiative and capacity building, it's important to mention where this opportunity and actually this funding to come and work together comes from. So some of you might be familiar with the Women and Gender Equality strategy, which was announced in 2017. And it's titled, It's Time, Canada's Strategy to Prevent and Address Gender-Based Violence. And it's the federal government's response to gender-based violence across Canada. It really builds on current federal initiatives. It coordinates with existing programs and really lays a foundation for greater action on GBV. And the strategies initiatives are organized actually across three pillars. So preventing gender-based violence, supporting survivors and their families, and promoting responsive legal and justice system. And so there's a focus here with this strategy, which was about filling the gaps and trying to also make sure that we are supporting diverse populations. One of which was listed and named out as an underserved group, including non-status refugee and immigrant women. So to tell kind of that story, for the Rights of Non-Status Women Network, this was the first time that members of the network were considering, for example, applying for this type of funding. So thinking about the grassroots kind of story of the network and the advocacy, the network had stayed away from some of this more kind of federal funding in order to remain fully grounded, more in community-based work without kind of some of those constraints that social service delivery agencies sometimes experience. But what really caught their attention was this first time that a funder had overtly recognized non-status women along with refugee and immigrant women as an underserved population. And parallel to this process is also Ocassie seeing this funding opportunity as an opportunity to build on its previous and existing GBV campaigns and its capacity building projects in the immigrant and refugee serving sector, and to collaborate further with the partners that it has established over the years in the sector. So let's fast forward a little bit. There's multiple planning meetings and coming together with community partners. And here we are. Ocassie has kind of taken the lead in bringing this project forward and bringing valuable expertise in terms of the work that it's done with survivor engagement, with capacity building, and public education campaigns. So this call to action is what we frame really as this like wage window of opportunity. And our collaborative team obtained this funding under the second pillar, which is supporting survivors and their families. And so now we have 5 years, which is actually now 4 years, to really develop the work that was already underway and to build more capacity for it at a national and regional level. This is what we're going to be referring to as our blueprint in progress. So very much as well, we want to emphasize that with this window of opportunity and with what the wage strategy outlined, this acknowledgement around the need to support non-status refugee and immigrant women also comes up with the importance in our job and the importance that WAGE has developed a knowledge center and has really highlighted the importance of research as well and to kind of blueprint some of this work. So it means that our job is to push forward and further the conversations about what it means when we think about survivor-led. What does it mean when we're doing this work, also including kind of more of a community-based, trauma-informed perspective, and how to make sure that we're doing that in just and safe and equitable ways. So you're going to hear a little bit more about that in today's presentation.
Okay, thank you, Margarita. And so we are super excited to be sharing our research findings with you today. We want to hear your questions. We want to hear your feedback, your insights. And so just a heads up, though, that we have a lot of information that we're going to cover. So just so you know, we will be sharing a copy of these slides and a copy of the recording from today's presentation. So write down what's useful, but don't feel like you need to write everything down. And also, we are talking about gender-based violence and other forms of oppression. So we just want to kind of pause and say, you know, if at any point you find it's a lot of information and you need to pause and take a break, you will have that recording, you will have the copy of the slides. So please do so, check in with yourself or check in with a colleague as you need. And Margarita mentioned this in the beginning, but for those of you who are just joining us, a reminder that if you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat. And we will save a little bit of time at the end to take up your questions. Okay. And so what you're seeing on this slide before we go to the next is a sneak peek of the cover of our report, which will be coming out, and it's got artwork by Aza Abaro, and her artwork is featured on a number of our slides and in our project. You'll also see some images from the stakeholder consultations that we conducted across Canada. So let's start now. Before getting into the findings, we did want to kind of pause first and share some key definitions that we're using in the literature and the research, as well as a little bit about the literature that we're drawing from in developing our approach. So bear with us. This is a little bit of information that we just want to get out there. Taskeen has kindly posted a longer handout in the chat, which has the longer definitions, but we have 4 key concepts that we will be using throughout that we just want to make sure everyone has the same basic knowledge. And keep in mind as well that we could spend a whole webinar on some of these terms, and there are lots of debates surrounding some of these terms. So in the interest of time, we're just going to share our basic working definitions in the project. So NSRI women, you'll hear us say this a lot, right? So it stands for non-status refugee and immigrant women. And so this is the main population that we're looking at in this project, knowing that on some level, this is a socially constructed way of categorizing a very diverse, heterogeneous group of people, right? And so there's going to be limitations to that. But in terms of our working definition, we're using the category women, for example, to refer to any individual who self-identifies as female, including but not limited to cisgender women, transgender women, intersex women, and two-spirit women. The NSNR there are immigration, and the NSR and I should say, are immigration categories, right? So what do we mean by refugee? We're using the term refugee to refer to any person who is forced to flee from persecution and who is located outside of their home country. Immigrant usually refers to a person who has settled permanently in a different country from where they were born and or where they hold citizenship. our category that we're using in the project includes both permanent and temporary residents under the category immigrant, right? So it includes temporary foreign workers, it includes international students, it includes visitors, right? So, so we're using it in a very expansive way. And then finally, their non-status. You know, a more limited definition refers to a person who has not been granted permission to stay in the country or whose permission to stay has expired. But we are using kind of a broader understanding of immigration status, right? So any person whose immigration status is precarious. And it's important here to acknowledge that while each of these immigration categories are distinct, they're also overlapping, meaning that they're dynamic, that a person's immigration status can change over time, the laws change, their situation changes. So we're using it in a dynamic way. Okay, second concept is gender-based violence, colloquially referred to as GBV, right? So this is an umbrella term. It's commonly defined as violence committed against someone based on their gender identity, gender expression, or perceived gender, right? And we know that GBV is not only physical, it can include sexual, emotional, psychological, financial, spiritual, and cyber abuse increasingly. It includes neglect, it includes criminal harassment or stalking, right? So an expansive definition of forms of GBV. We also know that GBV is not limited to any one site, right? People tend to think about GBV as in interpersonal relationships like domestic violence, family violence, but we know that it can also occur in the workplace and in communities. And in this project in particular, we recognize forms of GBV that are structural and institutional. So we're including an expansive definition. We're including poverty. We're including racial discrimination. We're including colonization, xenophobia, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, ageism, and restrictive immigration policies, among others, right? And in the handout, you'll see our more expansive definition. But the idea is that these systems work intersectionally to increase women's risks of violence, and they also produce barriers to support. These are deeply gendered systems, and so we include them in terms of a structured understanding of gender-based violence. And I'll now turn it on over to Nira, who's going to cover our last two definitions.
Thank you, Selena. So the last two definitions, we have community advocacy. So we understand community advocacy in our project. It uses a broad understanding of community advocacy as a form of advocacy conducted by grassroots groups and informal networks, beyond more formal service provisions, organizations, and programs. In the context of this project, we are seeking to build greater capacity we're seeking to build greater capacity for community advocacy among a diverse group of community members, such as non-status refugee and immigrant survivors, service providers, and other civil society leaders who congregate to develop survival-led, evidence-based solutions to gender-based violence. The next key definition or concept is survivor-centered. Survivor-centered is a term that has gained in popularity in recent years and refers to the practice of engaging survivors in development and implementation of programs. This engagement comes out as an effort to address power imbalances between those designing or delivering services and those who are receiving those services. In the context of this project, we understand survivor-centered or survival-led approaches as a model in which non-status refugee and immigrant women are leaders in informing policies and developing solutions to gender-based violence, rather than passive recipients of top-down or cookie-cutter services. We understand that non-status refugee and immigrant women know well the kind of programs and services that best fits their needs and the needs of their families. We see this approach as a promising practice, but we also want to approach it critically as you will see in the findings that we shared today. Over to you, Margarita.
Thank you, Nira. Thank you, Selena. So to kind of carry on with that conversation as well, it's important for us to just kind of acknowledge the different knowledges that we're building on. So who's kind of paved the way. And this kind of gives you a sense more around kind of our analytic framework, the literature review that we did in this research. When we think about GBV against immigrant and refugee communities, we know that it's a complex conversation in reality. And it requires attention, similar to what Selena was mentioning too, it requires attention to the impacts of economic exclusion, the insecure status in Canada, immigration status, racism, xenophobia, language barriers, and just understanding what happens when people are living with multiple forms of marginalization. And also the danger of knowing that what can happen when we're maybe perpetuating stereotypes or alienating communities that we're trying to reach when we're maybe discussing or thinking about gender-based violence. So we look to some of those discussions in the literature as well that really focus on thinking about how to disrupt the ways in which we address gender-based violence against and within refugee and immigrant communities in Canada. And we draw from discussions that say that typically and historically in Canada, some of the responses and the programming has been shaped around more of the needs of an ideal victim. So of the white settler, English-speaking, cisgender, heterosexual, and able-bodied woman, Canadian citizen. And so there's a discussion in the literature that really argues against what might be called a cookie cutter approach, or a way in which it's shaped around an ideal victim in terms of preventing gender-based violence and supporting survivors. And particularly understanding how this cookie cutter is not shaped around the specific needs of migrant and racialized communities. And at the same time, what comes out of the literature as well is a way to understand that perhaps we're not necessarily seeing our needs being met within mainstream approaches to the way that gender-based violence is being addressed. But at the same time, there can be complications if this work is only addressed or being able to be thought about within a more additive approach or within a kind of a specific type of programming. It becomes like specialized knowledge. So in part of that discussion, it's really important to think and to reflect on how this kind of mainstream diagnosis of the issue, the mainstream types of approaches might not see the full picture of the issue and of the problem when we're thinking about gender-based violence, right? And so also that's where some of this language comes out that says, what if we think about this as violence against certain communities, to really emphasize when it's structural, when it's systemic, and not just the violence that's happening within communities. So that's another way that we see in the literature that there's a challenging of what is considered kind of more of a mainstream approach or understanding. In addition to that, what's really important then is that we learn about the different types of approaches that have emerged and the different types of approaches and toolkits and literature and discussion that really addresses this idea and tries to ground the understanding of gender-based violence more in intersectionality. So an understanding of gender-based violence grounded in intersectionality. At the same time, we see that there's an emphasis around the social context of immigration and precarious status in Canada. So to kind of understand that relationship between immigration and GBV, it's important to understand also the colonial history of Canadian immigration policy and the kind of current growth that we're seeing in terms of precarious immigration status. So colonial histories have really shaped the pathways of migration and settlement in Canada, and it's influenced which people are able to enter and receive benefits or access to services in Canada as well. And what really strikes us and what's really important that we draw from in the literature is also how research is indicating that Canada's immigration system is increasingly by design becoming more and more precarious, and also that it's very much female-led immigration population that we see as prominent in Canada. So this has significant concerns. It's part of a discussion around what does that mean when there's state-led precarity that's being constructed through an immigration system, and what does that mean when it intersects with gender-based violence. So that's part of what, to give you a sense of what's kind of grounding our analysis. It's kind of shaping the questions that we pursued, and Selena's going to kind of cover a little bit more about what our methodology was and what our approach was in terms of the research.
Thank you, Margarita, for that excellent synopsis. So there's a lot of amazing knowledge and research being generated by feminists, anti-racist intersectional scholars and advocates. And so enter into this our humble community-based research project. So what are we adding to the conversation? Well, we really wanted to do a couple of things, right? Our primary objective in doing this research was to really test some of our assumptions. So those would be assumptions that were coming not only from our grounding in this literature, but also the assumptions that we had based on our advocacy work that we were doing in Toronto, through OCASI, through the Rights of Non-Status Women's Network, and through a host of other groups, right? So we didn't want to assume that what we were seeing on the ground in Toronto, working with and among non-status refugee and immigrant women, looked the same elsewhere, right? What were the local realities like in Ottawa? What were they like in Vancouver, Edmonton, Fredericton? These are the 5 sites in our project, and beyond those sites, right? What did safety and healing look like? How were advocacy strategies being developed? Okay. In addition to testing our assumptions, though, we also had other objectives as well. We wanted to build relationships. Community advocacy is all about relationships. So we wanted to meet more people. We wanted to engage, start building those networks. We wanted to collect baseline data so that we would know, be able to measure our impact and our effectiveness. And we also thought it was important to conduct our research in a way that would live out the principles of our project, right? So community-based, trauma-informed, anti-oppressive, these were all things that we kept in mind in the very design of our research. And so we're happy to elaborate on any of our methodological kind of approach information, if that's something you want to hear more about in the Q&A. But for now, let's keep moving. So what methods did we use? Well, we divided the project into 2 main initiatives. So one was an environmental scan, the second was a needs assessment. So the environmental scan, we started by collecting a wide repository of information that was publicly available. So community reports, academic articles, grassroots campaigns, a wide variety of materials relating to NSRI women, gender-based violence in Canada. We also then spoke to people in the 5 sites. So we spoke to a total of 76 service providers and community advocates. We also collaborated with the YMCA Halifax, another project that OCASI is partner on, to conduct a national survey where we heard from 276 workers primarily in settlement and anti-violence sectors. And we did additional outreach at conferences. In addition to the environmental scan, we also wanted to speak with non-status refugee and immigrant women directly, right? So we did focus groups and interviews, and survivors had the option of which format they preferred. We recruited participants through our connections with our partners on the project and other advocacy groups. We used that participatory community-based approach. So we didn't just go out there and conduct a focus group. We piloted the focus group with survivors as an initial step. We got their feedback, which was so critically important in the design of the focus group. We also didn't want to just go and use our research skills. We wanted to teach those skills as well. So we created a webinar for community organizations and partners who want to do their own research. We shared our process in an educational format. And you can also see there the distribution of people who we spoke to across the different sites. Okay. And just a quick illustration of our approach. So in the focus groups, for example, this is a tool that we used to help structure the sessions. It is an image that's adapted from Lynn Kazali, And rather than asking kind of, more traditional focus group, a series of questions, breaking out into groups, we used art and we used visuals. We didn't want people to feel pressure to tell their stories. We wanted them to help shape the conversation. So we identified different thematic areas that we wanted to cover in the conversation, but we tried to keep a lot of room for the people around the table to help steer the conversation in ways that were important to them. And we really felt a strong sense of responsibility to the survivors and stakeholders we spoke to. So we liked the metaphor of the journey, right? We wanted to talk with people and have a journey together with them and not at them. Great. And so let's finally get to our findings. And again, if you have questions about methodology, feel free to post them. Again, wonderful art here by Aza Abaro that I absolutely love. We're going to start by sharing some of our findings from our stakeholder consultations with advocates and service providers in the 5 sites. And we'll support that with some of the survey data. And then in the second part of what we talk about, we'll share findings from our needs assessment with NSRI Women. And for those of you who are just joining, a copy of these slides and a recording of the presentation will be available after. Okay. So what was our strategy in doing these consultations, right? We were bringing people together around the table. We wanted to do a community mapping exercise. So we started with, and this is a slide from one of our presentations, so you could see the types of questions we're asking. We wanted to start just by mapping, like what currently exists that's similar to what we're trying to do, and how can we build from what people are already doing in the region. So what types of survivor-led or survivor-centered groups are there? What kinds of community-based networks are there? What does that look like? So that was the mapping piece. And then we also created space for reflection, because oftentimes we're so busy doing this work, we don't have those spaces to like stop, take a step back and go, is this working? And we wanted to capture some of the regional realities. So what makes this work easy or hard to do in this region? What are some of the local realities that people were contending with? And so one of the baseline things that we found is what we refer to as our typology of advocacy, right? So we went in with a pretty solid idea of what advocacy looks like based on our own experiences. And we actually learned and discovered that there's such a wide variation in what advocacy looks like across the different regions. And that our typology kind of ranges from more formal networks to the highly informal networks. So just to give you a few examples, more formal networks include things like, local immigration partnerships, right? This is where people from formal organizations are trying to work cross-sectorally. And so they have these spaces where they come together. Advocacy campaigns, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, things like sanctuary campaigns or access without fear campaigns. We noticed that service providing organizations were trying to do a little bit more advocacy work. So trying to have more drop-in programs where people don't need to register, because sometimes that's a barrier, particularly if you don't have status, or if you're not sure if you qualify, or if you don't want to be labeled a survivor, you don't want to walk in and write down your name, right? So trying to have more meal sharing and drop-in groups for parents and things like that. Beyond that kind of service provision arena, though, we've also discovered a lot of community gatherings. So in some cases, it was faith-based groups that would have like a monthly gathering, and the topic of gender-based violence would be addressed, or they would invite in an immigration specialist to kind of talk about the ins and outs and the impacts of immigration on local communities. And then finally, we really were struck by these kind of highly informal networks that are driven mainly by community members themselves, with some interesting uses of technology, like WhatsApp groups that group of local immigrants are using to communicate with each other. And if you're a service provider and they enjoy engaging with you, you get invited to this WhatsApp group, and you get to kind of help field questions or just pass along things to make people happy, right? So so lots of WhatsApp groups. local neighborhood groups. So everyone in the same building, kind of when a new resident comes in, there's a group that will, help greet them and help them settle. And so we began to kind of hone in on these connectors, these people in the community that everybody knows to contact if you're having an immigration problem or a family dispute or things like that. And so those are the types of advocacy networks that we started to tap into. Okay, and I'll now hand it over to Margarita, who will talk about some of the challenges that people described in their reflections.
Great, thank you so much, Selena. So for this piece here, I'm going to speak to some of the challenges of doing advocacy work, and we're going to highlight 4 areas in particular that we were able to kind of narrate and report on, which is the first will be Advocacy Chill. The second focuses on navigating multiple systems. The third focuses on capacity, so doing the work off the side of my desk. And the fourth piece will focus on building solidarity between Indigenous and migrant groups. So in terms of Advocacy Chill, through our community conversations with stakeholders, we really heard evidence of this term, Advocacy Chill, on working with non-status refugee and immigrant women survivors. So Advocacy Chill really represented this kind of fear of losing funding or feeling muted, silenced. And for some of you on the call, this term might be familiar, and it refers to kind of this changing political climate that imposes an advocacy chill on government-funded, not-for-profit organizations. For example, in the settlement sector, we've learned how cuts to transportation or food budgets were areas that really impacted the ability to do some of the advocacy work in terms of gathering, having the meetings in person, doing some of that kind of collective work that lays the groundwork for further advocacy. So we see this kind of distancing that was happening in terms of this community piece and this community advocacy piece, and moving more towards professionalization, moving more towards different types of requirements for reporting and accountability. So we also really heard how an advocacy chill can undermine efforts to address GBV against NSRI women. So even in cases where we heard, for example, access without fear policies, we know that there's still issues there around what do we do if we're working with non-status migrant women, or less familiarity of what to do if you're working with non-status immigrant women. So for us, this advocacy chill really highlighted the role of these kinds of funding priorities, the mandates that shape who's eligible for services, where service providers distribute their time and resources, and it exposed an area of concern and challenge that service providers were expressing. And yet at the same time, as Selena mentioned, we also learned about all of this other kind of important advocacy work that continues to happen. As service providers are very much uniquely positioned to engage in public policy advocacy and social systems type change, and to really raise awareness on issues related to gender-based violence. And we saw very much issues related to gender-based violence, and in particular with intersections around immigration status. So it is also really important for us to acknowledge the important ways in which advocacy does happen through many different channels, which Selena did a great job with the typology. So we see it in other ways through engagement in planning tables, national councils, working groups, committees, boards, different umbrella groups. And so this isn't an effort for us, when we saw this as this kind of common challenge, to necessarily then kind of place this on service providers as in they're not doing enough. Instead, it's kind of trying to understand how it's taking place and wondering what would it look like if we had further capacity, support, resources to navigate and collectively do some of this work and this kind of advocacy work. Next up, we focus on one of the other common challenges was that service providers are navigating multiple systems. So service providers, when we were focusing on gender-based violence against NSRI women, they mentioned to us they're navigating lots of different systems. So if we think about it, just let's think about all of those different systems. We have an immigration system, we have a housing system, a healthcare system, child welfare system. There's so many to think about. And when we think and when we heard from service providers and advocates that the needs of NSRI women that they're attending to, they come at it from a holistic approach, and an understanding that people's needs are very much intersectional. And that's where there isn't this matchup. So advocates and service providers are then tasked and really burdened with navigating all these different systems and trying to understand also, we know this, that there's kind of changing regulations, rules, eligibility. And so we're learning that what happens is what could potentially also happen, and we learned from service providers, is what if advocates don't know all of these systems, which we're humans, to know all of these systems, know how to navigate them, and what could those implications be? So when we say this again, it's not about blaming or suggesting that service providers just need to have more capacity to learn about all of these systems, but I really feel that we hear in the conversation, and what we learned was, how do we redistribute some of this work so that there's more of us that are navigating this system in a more collective, collaborative way? So, and how do we challenge at the same time some of those bigger pieces around eligibility? So kind of being able to use more of a critical lens on it. And so we know that there's really great work happening, and it was remarkable to hear how service providers are doing all of this and really navigating so many systems, and also the way that they're creating task forces, and they're connecting with others, they're connecting with cultural councils and faith-based groups. And we wonder what happens then if we would be able to support service providers and advocates so that they can navigate all of these multiple systems, not in isolation, but to carry it out in a more collaborative, in a more working together type of way. Again, we emphasize this work about redistributing some of this work in navigation. Another piece in terms of challenges that we heard from the stakeholders and the community gatherings that we hosted was around capacity. And we heard this term of doing the work off the side of my desk. We heard that a lot. So let's kind of slow down. If we think about what happens when people are navigating many systems and they're taking a lot of this on their own, for example, as maybe as an individual within their organization, we get to this topic of capacity and this expression of off the side of my desk. So sometimes what happens is when we hear the focus on certain individuals that might have specialized knowledge, similar to what Selena was mentioning, like connectors, or for example, advocates or community members. But we also know that what is being tackled or what is being addressed or challenged is very systemic and structural. So the need for that to be taken on by more of a group of people and done in a more collaborative way. So lots of what we also heard from stakeholders was that they're dealing with and addressing issues that really speak to this kind of intersectional impact of different systems and marginalized group. And then at the same time, their own work is very much burdened by this. And so they're overworked or there's high turnover. We hear about this a lot within the sector. We can think about the immigrant and refugee serving sector and also the anti-violence women's sector. So this makes us think also about the leadership and capacity to do this type of work, and thinking about ways in which it can be done, not only bottom up or top down, but working more in a way that's with different members that are participating and thinking about doing this collaboratively. And lastly, we wanted to speak to also some of the challenges, and what we heard was around building, or the need to further kind of build and strengthen solidarity between Indigenous and migrant groups. And this was this part of the conversation with stakeholders and advocates really allowed us to focus and to hear the ways that service providers and advocates are thinking about structural forms of gender-based violence and thinking about other forms of violence that impact non-status and refugee and immigrant women. So it's really critical, we heard, that when we think about GBV, that we can't really rest our ideas on, we have to kind of continue, to challenge and think about sexism, colonialism, and racism. And it's important to be developing strategies that also have an opportunity to challenge the criminal justice system while providing safety for survivors of sexual and domestic violence. So we didn't see necessarily a lot of evidence of solidarity work between Indigenous groups and migrant groups, but we heard a lot of care and concern for doing this kind of work. And we also know that within the wage strategy, that kind of collaborative piece is something that's stressed. They heard in their own kind of research and roundtables as well, and the need to kind of think about colonialism through kind of an understanding that it's ongoing, and that it can also be a lens to consider the way that that kind of colonial imprint and its ongoing pervasiveness in terms of how it applies to immigration system. So really highlighted in this for us is the need that none of this work can be done alone, and that collaboration is very much necessary to do this work. That's what really came out while we heard some of the challenges in terms of doing the advocacy work. And I'll let Selena take over now.
Great, awesome. Thanks, Margarita. Okay, so Margarita shared a lot of the challenges that we heard from stakeholders in doing this work. At the same time, though, we want to also acknowledge that we also saw a lot of creativity, a lot of people working together to innovate and to try and find ways to transform oppressive systems, whether off the side of their desks or in their spare time, or having, you know, shelters in their homes, right? There was a lot of kind of that type of activity nevertheless happening. And one emerging practice that we thought was promising involved what's called access without fear. Many of you may be familiar with this topic, but for those who aren't, you know, access without fear refers to, you know, having services accessible regardless of immigration status, right? So where there's a clear policy around either not asking about immigration status, because sometimes just asking about it can create a barrier for folks who are living in fear of deportation. It can also, in cases where you need to ask about it, it can be doing it in a way that really kind of highlights that this is not immigration enforcement, and that access is available regardless of immigration status. It can also include a don't tell policy, which is a policy that kind of sets in place how the organization will interact in terms of border enforcement, right? So an active don't tell policy basically sets in place that any information or data about a person's immigration status will not be shared with CBSA, with Canadian Border Services Agency. So access without fear is something that individual organizations were developing their own policies within their organizations. It can also occur at the municipal level, so where you have local governments. Some people refer to this as like sanctuary cities, kind of, you know, having a policy in place where any city service is accessible regardless of immigration status. Just by virtue of being a resident in the city, one can access city services. And so we saw this as a promising practice, but also highly uneven, right? So Toronto, Vancouver, and Edmonton talked about the struggles to establish sanctuary city policies, and by collaborating with local municipal governments. Ottawa had also tried to do this, but was unsuccessful with their local city councillor, but then they shifted their strategy to work with local organizations to at least have within organizations active access without fear policies. But that means that currently this is an emerging practice, but it's also quite limited because it's uneven and it's unclear in many cases. You know, it's potentially confusing for people without status. You know, you might be promising access without fear, but not able to deliver it. And then so what kinds of vulnerabilities and harms come out of that? It's also pretty complicated to do it only at the grassroots level because there are plenty of services that are funded by multiple governments. And so what does it mean to have access without fear through one kind of government level when you have multiple kind of funding sources or governments kind of intersecting in a particular space? So there was very much a sense that we need to kind of scale up, right? This can be a local policy, but it also needs to kind of be a provincial wide policy, right? So a lot of kind of attempts to push that. And we can turn over to the next slide. So that was a little bit about our stakeholder consultations. We just wanted to check in briefly with our survey data, which largely supported a lot of what we were seeing on the ground and helped us interpret that. So again, just briefly, this was a survey that we conducted in partnership with the YMCA Halifax. And rather than having two separate national surveys and having workers have survey fatigue, we decided to work collaboratively together to share resources to do this survey. Let's keep moving. We're happy to answer questions about the method there. But in terms of what we found, so one of the questions on the survey tried to gauge from settlement and anti-violence workers what their connections with community-based organizations or groups looked like. And we found overall that the workers that we surveyed, the 276 across the country, were making moderate use of community-based networks in terms of referring clients to those groups or having their own connection to those groups. And so between 46 to 60%, 66%, and there was really no regional variation there, right? So this was consistent across all of the provinces where we had workers respond to the survey. And you can see there some of the more popular community drop-ins, right? Meal sharing, ethnic specific clubs, parent groups. And interestingly, the activist movements and advocacy groups kind of fell in the lower range of the types of community-based advocacy connections that people had. And so what this suggests to us is that there's a potential disconnect there, right? Between the service providers who are delivering formal gender-based violence supports to non-status refugee and immigrant women and the informal support networks. And so this ultimately supports the need for greater kind of connection between formal and informal supports and that kind of bridge building. We also wanted to draw your attention to some other survey data now that really captured some of the gaps in gender-based violence service provision that was reported by workers. And this largely supports existing literature, but you know, we were able to kind of tease out some interesting nuances there. So, you know, when it came to that formal service provision, we really found this kind of connection between how precarious one's immigration status is and the degree of access to services. So our organizations serving people who have no status or who have temporary status, there's kind of a direct correlation there. And moreover, non-status women in particular were among the most vulnerable and least protected, according to this, again, reports by workers. So roughly half of the agencies that we surveyed reported that they do provide services regardless of immigration status. And again, I should mention that this is not like a representative sample, right? We didn't, you know, it's people who volunteer to fill out the survey. So they're likely people that are already interested in gender-based violence and interested in refugees, newcomers, right? But even among that group that's highly interested in this topic, half of the agencies reported that they serve folks without immigration status. And again, we can unpack that. There's people might not want to admit it. Yet at the same time, when we asked them about the types of training that they were accessing, very few had received any training in GBV supports for non-status women, like 18%. And this is compared to numbers like 80% had you know, basic training in GBV awareness, right? So they're getting training in kind of that broad-based kind of cookie cutter model, but not necessarily getting the very specialized training that you need to be able to support people who are dealing with multiple issues. Same thing with basic training in immigration laws and policies. These were major gaps that we were seeing in the data. And so that kind of leads us nicely now to the needs assessment research, right? So we wanted to really talk to NSRI survivors themselves to hear their lived experience and their perspectives on these systems. I'll turn it over to Nira. Nira.
Thank you, Selena. Great. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us. So to the needs assessment now. So as we mentioned before, in the fall of 2019, we conducted a number of focus groups and interviews with non-status refugee women who have experienced gender-based violence in their lives. We wanted to hear their own impressions of the terms safety, healing, and leadership that are central to our project, and what it means to be a survivor. Were they comfortable with mainstream definitions? More significantly, what were their own definitions? How did they experience, and how does their experiences and perspective challenge our assumptions about what a survival-led project might look like? So the first definition, the first challenging assumption was leadership, and how did they challenge it? When we ask non-status refugee immigrant participants how they define leadership, and if this was something that was important or relevant to them, we noticed that very few of them identified themselves as leader. Some tended to see leadership as a very heavy word, something associated with a public persona, a political leader, a CEO of a company. Significantly, they did not see themselves as reflected on that category, nor was it something that they necessarily aspired or had the time, the energy, or the resources to engage in this kind of leadership. In fact, many felt a lot of pressure to be the ideal victim, the model minority. However, when we prompt our participants to share with us how they define leadership, the responses challenges those traditional understanding of leadership. For example, some participants describe qualities such as caring for others, being empathetic, or being resourceful as examples of what meaningful leadership looked like for them. As some participants put it, they said, a leader takes care of others. Another participant mentioned, I see leadership as someone who will open the path. Consequently to this, as we listen to our participants describe the types of support that they provide to their peers, we began to see leadership in a very different way. They see it as taking initiatives in their own lives, as producing leadership among friends to improve their well-being in the community. They see leadership for participants is about positive change at the local level. Leadership for them is not about personal gains, but it's about the well-being of the community and perhaps about personal growth. I'm going to pass it now to Margarita so she can talk about how this can transfer to the blueprint.
Thank you, Mira. Thank you. So what does this mean then as we are developing our own project and everything that we were hearing? How do we ensure that non-status refugee and immigrant women have equitable and accessible options to participate as leaders based on their terms? How do we create leadership opportunities that allow non-status refugee and immigrant women, survivors of gender-based violence, to start where they're at and to access available support and services so that they're not necessarily denied opportunities to participate, understanding that process? And so how do we provide also spaces to reflect on one's lived experience and this opportunity to also kind of challenge some of these terms that are being used, and building skills really for collaborative leadership. So this first idea is really what Nsri was summarizing as well, is that this idea to really avoid equating leadership with being perfect in some way or exceptional. An exceptional or a model immigrant, or this idea of how to be a victim. So having to, for example, recount pain or certain processes, which is what we heard as well. Leadership as being something that's about a process. So a process of learning from experiences and mistakes, and having the courage to be vulnerable, and this collective process that really requires different types of support, but ultimately views this vulnerability and views this process as already part of their leadership. Another piece that we think about in terms of this redefining of leadership is that we need to avoid placing kind of the burden of change on survivors, of reinforcing this kind of feeling that there's might be something missing. So making sure that they know that they're not alone, making sure that we're not necessarily reproducing some of the pressure that can be involved even with a role like the leadership role. So understanding where people are at. And this really draws and really allows us to emphasize the need for it to be equitable. So making sure that the leadership role is equitable. That means that it is remunerated, that it's valued. So it should be paid equitably. If people are, in terms of honorarium or the work that and engagement and time that they're taking to be a part and to be leaders in their community, that it should be about ongoing conversations about the resources that individuals may need to ensure that they can participate. And ultimately, it's really like this creation of a community of care where everyone who's involved is part of this leadership in social change. And this is where we really think about the valuing of diverse forms of leadership that Mira was emphasizing that we heard. And in particular, key question that stays for us is how do we make sure that when we're building this leadership, that we're also not absolving what our role and our accountability, right, in terms of our own process in taking action.
Right. So the next challenging assumption that we tested with the needs assessment was about survivor. So some non-status refugee and immigrant participants felt that being labeled a survivor was very limiting. As one of them pointed out, I'm more than my experience. I want to get support now for what I want to do. What comes like this conveyed us to how when non-status refugee and immigrant women are labeled a survivor, everything they have access to is reduced to that specific trauma. Whereas when we ask participants what safety and healing look like for them, they talk about wanting spaces where they could be more than their trauma, where they will always, where they wouldn't have to tell their stories about abuse, where they could also experience joy, connection, and mutual care. They talk about soccer clubs and dance parties and places to gather together, all of that in addition to spaces for counseling, disclosing, or sheltering. There is also something very, very final about the term survivor. It's in the past, it's past tense. It makes it sound like you survived one instance of violence, one act or one event. When for many of the participants we spoke to, they are continually surviving multiple forms of violence, not just one act or one form of violence, but ongoing violence at the systemic and individual level. So we began to think of survivorship as a process, not a label or identity or a one-time thing. Other participants commented on how terms like refugee also impose a label on them that they could never shake. As one participant noted, when you arrive as a refugee, wherever you go, you're a refugee. People ask you, so why did you come? People ask you that because you're a refugee. Your term, refugee, is maintained. Even if you change your situation, always on your forehead, it says you're a refugee. This conversely leads to a feeling of dehumanization, the very opposite of what the term survivor was originally intended for. The critiques of the term survivor that non-status refugee and immigrant participants share with us were also raised in different ways by the stakeholders we consulted. For example, in the Vancouver consultation, service providers shared with us some of the stories of how the term survivor originally came about. There was an acknowledgement that the term survivor was originally introduced to challenge the common use of victim. as a strategy for using more empowering language. However, some participants argue that the term has become a stand-in for the same thing, and there is a need for more nuanced understanding of healing as a non-linear and as a complex process. Back to you, Margarita.
Thank you, Nira. So yes, in terms of what this means for our blueprint, for our project, is when we're thinking of reimagining what Nira was mentioning here about the survivorship, safety, we're hearing that safety and healing and this role of survivor are complex, and that it's also about avoiding to frame survivorship as this one-time static event or label, and really considering how surviving is an ongoing process. We heard that the most in terms of when we talked about safety and healing. And so also not limited to one source of oppression, challenging ideas about safety and healing. So what about collective safety? What about collective healing from structural harms? We heard this as well. And then creating capacity for healing to happen outside of this survivor-like label. That was very much something that struck us, and we heard about creating neutral spaces. So where people feel that there can be neutral spaces and safe places for non-status and refugee immigrant women to access and to feel human, where it's not necessary to have to recount your hurt and pain. As Nira mentioned, we heard about some ideas of just wanting to play sports and have opportunities and spaces where they can participate in joyful activities as well. And making decisions about what those activities and what participation would look like, very much premised on their terms and what they are defining. All right, so we've heard now from Selena, Nira, and I have been sharing what came from the stakeholder consultations, from the survey data, and from the interviews with non-status and refugee immigrant women. And this is the part here where we kind of talk about what's the road ahead, and we really see our findings as serving as a compass to develop this blueprint in progress. Today I'm going to focus on 4 points that we draw from the insight from the findings that we just shared. And we read it alongside what was originally the wage strategy, so what's kind of outlined in that wage strategy. And it's an opportunity for us to see what we're proposing, right? What we proposed with this project as we're developing this blueprint. So the first point that I want to talk about is when we're centering non-status refugee and immigrant women, survivors, challenging that concept of survivors of gender-based violence. So how do we do this work in equitable ways? And how do we ensure, from what we're hearing, that we're not repeating some of the harms? We can confirm that from what we heard, that survivor-led approaches are an important component towards safety and towards healing and collective forms of healing and safety among NSRI communities. But we also need to move forward with caution. So we need to challenge some of our kind of conventional understandings, as we heard from Nira, around leadership, find ways to value the forms of individual and collective leadership that are already a part of how NSRI survivors are caring and relating to their communities. We also need to really be careful not to reinforce some of these discourses that we heard around perfectionism, as we hear, and what can be attached to these new terms that we're constantly hearing within our sectors around creating champions and peers and leaderships. So what does it mean for us to really kind of try to create those opportunities and to be well informed by what women are sharing with us, to make sure that it's a place where there can be learning, where there can be vulnerability, and we can be doing this collectively. So we also need ways of thinking about what it means to be a survivor, which is what was emphasized earlier by Nira. So thinking about surviving as an ongoing process. And also what stands out for us in centering non-status refugee and immigrant women and this kind of survivor-led model is that we know that it's not intended to replace the community service provider work and also the kind of state accountability for preventing and responding to multiple forms of violence. Instead, it's thinking about the ways that it informs the work, the ways in that we're doing this collectively. which leads me to the second point, which is this idea of collective impact. So we heard from stakeholders and the service provider information and the forums that we held, is that there needs to be further support to really restore the advocacy work that happens among the sectors and that's happening perhaps in silos, so happening more in isolation. And so this, in other words, to take that term of working off the side of our desks, what happens if we pull our desks together and we're building like a larger table, for example? And what we also heard through this conversation is something that that's emphasized that we don't necessarily get to do that often in our work, which is more of a process-oriented approach. So challenging, it can be a challenge in our work because it can feel too abstract. We're used to certain approaches in our own work that's also very much defined by our kind of funding priorities and our mandates, right? So it can be kind of more linear, deliverable approach, but that doesn't always necessarily require us to collaborate. So it's also this idea of maybe it's going to be messy, and we use this term a lot when we were doing the research and when we were speaking with different groups. There can be a messiness, and there's this process of trust building in community, and that's okay as it's part of this process of collaboration. The third point that I really want to also emphasize in terms of how the findings are serving as a compass as we continue to think about this piece in our project is that what we heard very much was this approach towards a progressive understanding of gender-based violence that also includes a structural understanding and systemic side to violence. When we think about gender-based violence, we do think of it often in terms of more of this force, physical coercion. We also know that it's verbal. We as Selena was mentioning earlier, there's different ways in which gender-based violence, and we know that that's been amplified and that over the years our definition and understanding of it has expanded. However, at the same time, focusing a little bit more on those systems and causes of violence or harm and naming them as such, which I think is something that we're really hearing from service providers as well. Naming these experiences as violent in terms of who's being excluded or not able to access some services, the way that the pathways to immigration are shaping experiences of violence, but also violent in themselves. So this kind of shifts that conversation from not only trying to find solutions that focus on the way the problem is already defined, but thinking and creating spaces and meetings and discussion where that conversation can be furthered for us to find other ways in which we're naming and thinking about violence. And this is very much in line actually with what we, in their original kind of strategy and their approach, acknowledging this need to kind of have an understanding of gender-based violence, what they call gender-based violence plus, but understanding of gender-based violence from an understanding that considers these different kinds of intersectional implications in the social locations of different groups and populations within Canada. So for us, what we're highlighting there is the need to really further our understanding of gender-based violence so it's grounded in intersectionality. And we hear this a lot when we hear the term and that buzzword intersectionality, but it's about an aim for how that looks in practice. And the last point that I want to emphasize as well is that this piece that we really heard in terms of an area of concern and challenge, which is how do we build solidarity across Indigenous efforts and migrant groups when talking about gender-based violence against non-status refugee immigrant women and talking about violence and the healing that's required in communities across Canada. And that brings in this other piece as well in terms of kind of opens up the lens and the thinking around the different forms of violence and thinking about that systemic side. As we mentioned earlier, that also means to really complicate the relationship in the ongoing kind of colonialism and the colonial imprint that we see in the way that it's shaped immigration systems and also this increasing kind of precarity within the immigration system. So to kind of wrap up and bring that together, our findings really, we see this as kind of an opportunity to address these different forms of gender-based violence that racialized, non-status, refugee and immigrant women are facing every day. So there was this emphasis around the everyday forms of violence. And so at the same time with our project, it seems we're seeing the work around shifting the ways in which we're thinking about gender-based violence against non-status refugee and immigrant women and communities, and also helping build further community-based supports and leadership opportunities to keep communities safe. So this means that the way we narrate and that we talk about violence, including requires us to think about those structural sides. So the goals then for us are to think about ways to increase equitable opportunities for leadership and participation in addressing and thinking about gender-based violence that's at a community-based level. So we really see this opportunity for our project to support and build on what currently exists, but really how we roll this out is critical, and we've been talking about this as a team. We learned from conversations with our stakeholders, with NSRI women, that we need to kind of move at the speed of trust. So focus on this process. The importance of the community engagement. This type of knowledge exchange for us is also really important. And it really nods and gestures to a return to more activist movements that founded settlement work and anti-violence work in Canada. So this kind of collaborative work. And somehow, though, we haven't talked about the COVID-19, and that's actually our fifth point. And that's something that didn't necessarily exist when we were doing the research, but I want to focus on that, and that's what the next slide focuses on, is that here we are in this moment, and to really understand this crisis, this COVID-19 crisis, we need to understand that this crisis stems from another crisis. And that's where this language came from on April 30th when we hosted our first roundtable. We heard from organizational leaders and advocates and community members that said this was already a crisis. And they're referring to this was already a crisis in terms of addressing gender-based violence against NSRI women, the challenges that they were facing in terms of doing so. So the implications of COVID-19, they're really revealing this kind of architecture of inequality, and those who are already unprotected before the pandemic are impacted differently and more fatally during this time. And this has serious implications for addressing GBV against NSRI women. So we hosted this session, and we were able to kind of hear, what does this mean for addressing GBV against non-status refugee and immigrant women in Canada? How can we work collaboratively and collectively to better respond to GBV against non-status refugee and immigrant women? And we also heard that COVID-19 has opened this kind of window for necessary change, and we're seeing some political will. But in order for us to continue to be responsive to some of these changing realities and the needs of our communities and partners, we do need to continue to host and have these conversations. We learned at this roundtable, and we've learned through our planning meetings as well with our community partners, that the social conditions and the emerging social problems are longstanding and an ongoing crisis. Community members really shared with us as well that there's this emphasis and a need to be consulting with the groups that have been doing this work in terms of being able to identify what areas are not being addressed, or to think of some of the challenges and to look at it through this kind of intersectional lens, right? We also learned through our regional partners and participants in these calls how they're distributing their attention to services, especially when we're being asked to isolate. And also now, because we have people in different regions, we're also learning what does it look like as we're in different phases of reopening across different provinces and cities. So we're learning about how service providers are trying to attend to the immediacy, but they're already thinking about the important kind of advocacy and preventative work that will need to follow post-COVID. So those are pieces that we're hearing, and what this really underscores, and this is where we kind of circle back, is that what we heard in our stakeholder consultation, some of the challenges, we see even more of that need to do this work. We cannot be doing this work alone, but that kind of collaborative need to be doing the work. And in addition, it really supports that we now see this kind of political will. So part of our work is to continue to make those demands, to continue to raise some of this public awareness so that this work can continue to be supported and further supported post-COVID. And I just want to share that this is a beautiful visual summary. We also can share the recordings as well. And we're really fortunate that Carolyn is from Brilliance Mastery is joining us today on this call. So hopefully after this roundtable, we will also have like a visual summary, a way to kind of map this conversation and some of the highlights that we'll be sharing with each of you as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Selena.
Yes, thank you so much. And so we wanted to end before turning to a Q&A, but really end with a call to action, right? So we've been doing this research, we've been kind of immersed in this space of trying to understand what currently exists, trying to challenge our own assumptions, and now we're ready. We're ready to bring people together to have these conversations. It's already starting in the chat function as well, right? So we're going to have, we're rolling out a series of these webinars, each really situated in the local communities. We've been talking kind of broad strokes, national level findings today, but we want to bring communities together. So if you're part of a local network in those cities, please join us. If you're not in that city, but you are curious about what things look like there, please join us for our upcoming webinar series. It's already started in the chat, so people are talking about, sanctuary cities. It's in my city, but it's not working, or it's being rolled out in ways that are harmful to people. So that's the type of information that we want to kind of get into deep discussion around. And look for potential strategies to advocate. We had comments about the child tax credit, the financial impacts on communities, a call for more research. We really don't know a lot about non-status communities in particular because of the difficulties of conducting research with this group. We've had some good synergies happening in the chat around building capacity to do no harm as kind of a major kind of takeaway, and we really appreciate those comments. It's a great way of thinking about it. So if you know of folks that might be interested in participating in these initial conversations where we're hoping to kind of roll out an advocacy network in these cities, that would be great. Please invite them. If you know of NSRI women, people with lived experience that want to join these conversations, we really, are looking to bring lived experience and center that as well as an important source of knowledge in these spaces. We're also in the process of developing some training as well for peer champions, and we want to set up a national network of NSRI survivors where they'll receive training, but also start to inform and really shape the advocacy work that we're doing. So that's where we're headed. So please do join us. And I think we're ready now to take any questions. We have a little bit of time left, and sure. I think, Margarita, I don't know if you want to add anything there, but we have a little bit of time now to address any questions that came up in the chat.
Asking to see the visual summary again, so I'm just going to kind of flip back to that.
Great.
We did have some really great questions, and thank you, Selena. You went through some of them. There's actually a question, I think this one would be for you, Selena. It's asking, how can I join the Rights of Non-Status Women Network? That was great. That was one of the first.
I swear I didn't plant that question, anyone. So we're a grassroots network. It's basically all you need to do is email us. Our email address is rightsofnonstatuswomen@gmail.com. I'll write that in the chat. We normally meet monthly, but with COVID, we've been doing virtual meetings every 2 weeks. So, that's one of the silver linings of COVID is that we've been able to connect more frequently. And it's purely grassroots. So it's whoever can come, whoever can show up. There's no kind of hierarchy to the organization. So all are welcome to join.
And I guess I'm going to go on to, there's another question that we received as well in terms of if there's going to be any workshops or training. in terms of becoming community advocates or joining the Nsri network and advocacy groups. And Selena, you did a fantastic job sharing a little bit about what opportunities and how that will work. And just to keep in mind that the upcoming Roundtable series will be focused there'll be snapshots of the different regions. We have regional partners in 5 different cities. So it'll take place in Fredericton, it'll take place in Ottawa. We'll have one that'll be hosted as well for Toronto, Edmonton, and Vancouver. And these sessions in this Roundtable series will really serve as kind of like a launch for what is the community advocacy network for that region. And something to highlight, again, there's so much content that we could share during this presentation, but just to highlight, in all of the regions where we went and we were able to meet with stakeholders and community advocates, we learned about such great work that's already underway. And perhaps it's not called a community advocacy network. It doesn't, that's kind of a term that we were using to talk about that kind of work. But we learned about those groups and initiatives, planning tables. And so what we're hoping is that we can further support that work that is already underway and support it in a way to also bring us together in conversation at this kind of national level. So I encourage you to participate in the Roundtable series. And I'm being a little biased here, but I almost encourage you to take the whole series because, and then wherever you are across Canada in these regions, this will be an opportunity for you to learn further about how you can participate. And also then you'll be meeting the regional partners who will be co-chairing that network in that region. So it's a really great way for us to be connecting. That's part of the intention for the upcoming Roundtable series in the different regions. And then in terms of joining what is being mentioned as the NSRI network, that's modeled after the Peer Champion network, or sorry, the Peer Champion campaign that Mira is the coordinator for. And we will currently, right now, we are working with peer champions, we're calling peer champion leads. So people that expressed interest to participate as peer champions when we were in our research phase. And so it may be non-status refugee immigrant women who participated or who may have also been part of our community gatherings. And so we're going to then do more of a call out to see if there's more interest to participate as a peer champion, but we're kind of starting small right now. But there will be opportunities to participate, and then from there to see what activities are happening as well in each of the regions. I'm going to try my best. There's a lot of questions here, but there's a few that we had kind of flagged with Tuskeen. So another question, and this is a really great question, and I'm glad it came up, is how were the sites selected? So how were the cities selected? And I think that something really important is that just we kind of go back to our story of where we started and having an understanding more about the local understanding for perhaps in Toronto, the local context, and the interest to kind of look at this at a more national level. A lot of our connecting with other organizations came from the already existing relationships that we had as either a network, but also with OCASI that does some of the work around immigrant and refugee serving sector. So that was really important because it was about existing relationships that were there and kind of building on that. And just keep in mind that right now it's focused on these 5 regions, but a big piece of this project is to develop a blueprint with the idea that that blueprint could be adopted by other regions. So in this case, we had some of those kinds of major cities, right? We've got Vancouver, we've got Toronto, we've got some smaller cities as well, and also areas like Fredericton that are in a different kind of phase of even receiving more immigrants. And so just to keep that in mind, the idea is that we're going to be able to have that kind of snapshot and that understanding, but it'll serve as a blueprint so that it can be taken up by other regions, other cities across Canada. Let's see here. We had some really great questions around in terms of the research, again, as we mentioned, people are interested to know when we'll be sharing some of the findings in terms of the report. So right now we're going through this kind of roundtable series. We're making some edits, for example, to our reporting. We've kind of finalized that stage in terms of from the environmental scan, from the needs assessment, and the idea is that all of this will be available on our website, and the recordings from all of the different series, the visual summary. So please, and a place for you to kind of stay in touch with us is to access the website, but also to please join our community of practice, which is on SettleNet. When we share and distribute the information from this, so the handout and the PDF, we'll be sure to include the information for how you can stay involved and stay in touch with us, where you're going to get updates from the project, including information around the reporting. All right. Is there any other, I'm now kind of not able
Margarita, someone was asking about any advocacy around the child tax credit. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so pardon the way that I frame this, but you know, there are folks who don't have the capacity to access the child tax credit for their children because of their status. And so someone was asking if there's been any advocacy around that. So I just wanted to flag that the Rights of Non-Status Women's Network, we just released a campaign, and that was one of the campaign items. It was, we have a statement around COVID-19 and all of the different ways that non-status women are being impacted, and the child tax credit was one of those campaign demands to make it accessible to all parents, regardless of your immigration status. AVGO in Toronto, AVGO of the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic, has also been doing some phenomenal work around challenging, like I believe the constitutionality, no, charter, charter challenge, I believe, about that. Some of you might, some of the lawyers around this table might know a little bit more about that, but she's been doing some fantastic advocacy about that in case you want to look her up. And we'd be happy to connect you at the network if that's something that you want to address.
Thank you, Selena. Thanks.
Can I just add one more question? I think that sort of relates to the advocacy.
Sure.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I think it was, has there been any research on the percentage of women who relapsed after surviving from gender-based violence within the Nsri community, and whether this could help keep track of the women who fall back because of loopholes that weren't covered beforehand?
I'm happy to tackle that one, and feel free to jump in, anyone else. I think it's a really excellent question. I think it's something that we need research on. I mean, we don't even have current numbers on the number of non-status people in Canada. We've been using the same numbers for the last 10 years based on an estimation. In the United States, they at least use census data to try to figure out like an approximate percentage of the population that doesn't have status, but we don't do that here in Canada. So you can get a sense of like the lack of data. So this is something that, you know, maybe the advocacy networks in this group want to take on, doing some local data collection and blueprinting, like how to do that in a way that keeps people safe, so that at least you have some data in your local community about non-status folks. But and certainly the intersections between gender-based violence and immigrant precarity, I mean, that's a huge issue, and to have some data around that would be phenomenal. So I think it's a great suggestion.
Thank you, Selena.
Yeah.
And I think just to even, there's another question that was posed, which is around the racialization of non-status refugee and immigrant women. And we hosted, now it feels like a really long time ago, but it was, I believe, end of June, I want to say, where we looked at the spread of racism and that intersect with gender-based violence in the current context of COVID-19. And really what came out of that conversation as well is that, you know, the racialization of non-status refugee and immigrant women, and when we see kind of the trends in terms of precarity and the temporality, and we see that it's a process, undeniably we can't, that intersect is so important to think about. So in particular, what we were hearing there is that's kind of where we were talking about all of these multiple different systems, and that can't just be a focus narrowly on one aspect, but holistically we're looking at this kind of understanding of how gender-based violence is required through an intersectional kind of lens, and understanding what that means. Because as we also heard within our own research as well about the kind of inherent racism within the immigration system. So that's one side of that as well. We heard that come out so much in the last roundtable, right? Like, what systems are inherently already racist, and what does that do, right, in terms of what that means for this kind of work and for addressing GBV and responses as well. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an important question, and thank you. I think it was Blessing who raised it. I think at the network, we also have recently released or drafted a statement that we're going to be presenting to the Toronto Police Services Board here around anti-Black racism and police violence. And what we're trying to do there is really draw the connections between immigration enforcement and policing, and how that particularly impacts Black communities, where you have cases of, for example, in Ontario, there was, we have a don't ask policy in police, but we don't have a don't tell policy. So even though they're not supposed to ask you about your immigration status unless they have a bona fide reason to do so, there's certainly been cases where folks who are, reporting a crime, a victim of a crime, being turned over, or their information being turned over to CBSA. We're also particularly concerned under COVID-19, where you have, this kind of expansion of enforcement of public health measures. So people giving out tickets, enforcing, the wearing of masks and the social distancing. We know that that type of enforcement is just going to intensify for communities that are already over-policed. So there's a lot of important connections. And also when it comes to gender-based violence, we know that Black women and women of color don't always feel safe reporting to police, and instances where, they may be calling out for help and calling police for help in situations where they're facing death or violence, and either risking immigration enforcement or experiencing police violence. So these are huge issues in Canada, not just in the United States, and it's something that we want to bring to the table, the lens of immigration enforcement and immigration status, and the gendered kind of dimensions there to these conversations.
Great, thank you, Selena, and very much. I think there also you're really also speaking to when we kind of started and we talk about like who's paved the way, the work that's been done, and very much that it came from a space of challenging this and thinking about how the more mainstream, we can call, kind of approaches that were focused on criminalization or this idea of the police being safe, but the police are not always safe. So that we definitely see also in that literature, decades of work, and we see it kind of being articulated in different efforts. The community-based piece is a really important part of, and the community-based advocacy piece is a really important part of that, with kind of disrupting that narrative as well.
There's another question that's sort of related to this, which comes out of our stakeholder consultations, and that's regarding working to build the solidarity between migrant communities and Indigenous communities. And the question was, would you be able to share examples of how this can be done in a collaborative way?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think this is one of the areas that we're excited about, a lot of potential for this project, but this is certainly something among our project team that we're really excited about, the possibility of being able to add to the solidarity work that's being done and try to bring more capacity to that, because it's certainly something that advocates want to do. Many of the advocates we spoke to want to do, but maybe don't know how or don't have the capacity since they're working off the sides of their desks, right? And I think one of the areas where we see a lot of kind of a window of opportunity for advocacy work is around the very large, significant epidemic of violence against missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. Like this is, colonial violence is a major issue. And how can we position our conversations around gender-based violence to always acknowledge that and look for ways to kind of work in solidarity around those issues, because it's a tangled web when you're speaking out about violence in non-status refugee and immigrant communities. There can be a tendency to position Canada as a space of relative gender equality, or a space where, you know, violence doesn't exist in the same way that it might exist elsewhere. And that completely obscures the very real and systemic and ongoing violence that's being experienced by our sisters. So that's, you know, it's a major area where we think we can build a lot more solidarity. And we've seen examples of that. For example, when the previous government announced the Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, some of you may remember that. I was at a press conference with members of the network where we stood alongside Indigenous groups to say, you want to know what's barbaric? Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. That's what's barbaric. So so there may be creative ways that we can stand together to really tackle this issue in a systemic way.
Thank you, Selena. There's just one clarification that came in from Blessing, which is with respect to the race question. And the question was specifically regarding our methodology. So was race a factor that we took into consideration when determining the NSRI women that were interviewed, or was it a random selection process?
So we selected through our network. So we recruited participants through our partner organizations, through the community groups that we were already connected with. So you know, we didn't have any kind of capacity to recruit or even collect data on race. It's certainly something, the women that we spoke to were a highly racialized group. And you know, it's certainly something that in the reporting of it that we can unpack, but no, it was not something that that went into the research design in that way, because we simply, you know, didn't have the capacity for that. I don't know if Margarita, if that's something that you, I mean, I think it's something that, you know, advocacy groups, as we kind of carry forward, you know, there may be ways in which we can kind of, it certainly came through in some of the conversations, right? So there are ways in which gender-based violence and structural violence is manifesting for different communities. And that certainly came through loud and clear in the data. And we certainly saw that among the different groups that we spoke to as well. So, so I think it's something that moving forward, we might be able to build more capacity for, but
There's one last question that I think might be helpful, if you could just quickly answer that, which was, did any financial areas come out of our needs assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming by financial areas, you're referring to like the financial impacts for NSRI women. That's certainly, so one of the things that we didn't really get into, and it's something that we know from existing research, is that the structural barriers, right? So things like access to transportation, access to daycare, employment, housing, like these structural systemic issues that we have been talking about for so long were so pervasive, right? In both for the providers in terms of what their clients were struggling with, as well as on the in terms of the NSRI women. So we focused our findings today on like the model that we're trying to kind of unpack and extend, but that's not to say that those gaps aren't pervasive, and we're hoping that that's something that our advocacy networks and our NSRI kind of champions can really hone in and focus on. So housing across the board, every region we were in, housing came up as an issue. Access to daycare, employment, eligibility, language access, eligibility for services. These were across the board, and we know this from previous research as well. So thank you for your question.
Thank you, everybody, for your questions. I think I'm just going to kind of go back to that last slide to encourage you to write down the dates for the upcoming roundtable sessions, and just repeat to everyone that we're really grateful for you joining us today, joining us in this conversation. We will be sharing the PowerPoint, the recording, and we have a survey that we'll be sharing with everyone who's registered, so you'll receive it via email. And we'll be sure to also outline there the ways in which you can stay involved through our community of practice. So that will be another opportunity for you to kind of receive project updates. We definitely share like our events and any kind of key information on that settlement of practice, and we encourage you to join us. And thank you very much. I mean, we have we still have 9 minutes left.